Hi everybody. I'm following up on our IEP PowerPoint so that you can use this as a reference guide when you're working on your IEP assignment. I will apologize in advance for the background noise. They're doing construction in my basement, so if you hear odd sounds, sorry about the noise. So we're going to focus in this video looking at present levels of performance. I've got a separate video that looks at goals and benchmarks, so we're going to flip past that part, and if we have time in this video, I'm going to talk about times and services. But let's start here at the beginning of the process. When we're looking at IEPs, we know that a student has to be identified as having a disability, and we know that an IEP cannot be written in isolation by a teacher, by an administrator, but it has to be written by the IEP committee, or in Kentucky it's known as the ARC, the Admissions and Release Committee. So that committee requires that we have parent inclusion, parent or guardian. You have to have a general education teacher and a special education teacher and an administrator. And then the parents or guardians or school can invite other people, including any therapists working with the student, if there are any advocates or outside experts, if we're looking at a transition IEP, people in the community that might be providing supports. But those key components are: you have to have family involvement, you have to have a general educator and a special educator. And those people can't be waived, they can't disappear. They're supposed to be part of the process for the entire meeting, providing input. When we're working with kids with moderate to severe disabilities, a lot of times general educators will say, I don't know the kid, I don't have anything to add. And that is a failure on the part of our special education teachers. We need to be working with general education teachers to make sure that they understand their role in an IEP meeting. And their role is to provide that typical development information, information about peers, information about the content pre and post the grade the student is in or the ability the student is working with. They're the voice of the general education environment. So they need to be there and they need to be prepared to talk about those components. And we as special educators really need to make sure they understand that. As special educators, we are there to provide data about the child's progress and where they are meeting and where they are not meeting general education expectations and requirements. So before an IEP, we've got some planning we need to do as special educators, and that includes extensive data collection on the student's strengths and areas of need. We need to make sure that any evaluations that have been approved are completed and that we have all the needed information for the IEP, all the components of the IEP. We need to make sure the participants are there and that we're following the law as far as the requirements for days of notice for parents, that all participants are available, and that's part of our planning process. So in addition to making sure we have all of our formal and informal assessment data, if we have any functional behavioral data, an FBA, a BIP, all that information needs to be there. IEPs are supposed to be developed as a committee. A lot of times we do draft out different parts of the IEP, but we need to be very clear with parents that this is just a rough draft, this is just our first thought, and we can change any and all of this that is agreed upon by the committee. And there's not majority rules in an IEP meeting. It's always consensus and agreement, and we need to make sure that we're very careful to ensure that parents are included. So let's talk, I'm going to skip through a few slides. We just talked about the participants. And we know the IEP components. We've talked about that extensively in class. We're going to flip right through, keeping going till we get to the requirement. Oh, ITP, remember that's for students past the age of 16, although it's highly recommended, especially for students with moderate to severe disabilities, that we start looking at that as early as possible. I worked with kindergartners, first and second graders primarily, and I had second graders telling me what their long-term plans were. Those are things we need to consider as we look at the IEP. So we definitely need to think about these things when we come into the meeting. We need to have with us results of any classroom observations and assessments. We need to ask for and think about, before the meeting usually, any strengths that the parent sees for the child and any concerns that they might have. We need to think in advance about all the accommodations that are possible and needed by the student, and if any assistive technology is needed. We also need to think about positive behavioral interventions and anything else the student might need. and really make sure that we understand that the difference between accommodations and modifications is accommodating means I'm opening up access to the curriculum as it is written. So that could be something like giving a student a reader for content that is on grade level. Whereas a modification means I'm going to take that content and I'm going to modify it significantly, removing part of the content to make it accessible for a student. Sorry about the noise, guys. All right, so we're going to focus on the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Hang on just a second. So this section is called the PLAAFP. If you're talking in schools, they will talk about the PLOP or the PLEP. That was old terminology. After IDEA 2004, it changed to this current acronym, and that's the one that hopefully educators are using, but know that that's kind of an interchangeable term. This PLAAFP is our baseline, and it's telling us about the unique learning strengths and needs of a student. So when you're writing your PLAAFP, I want you to really focus on best practices, which are making sure you have data that demonstrates students' strengths and areas of needs. And when you are writing, that you are objective and positive. You want to make sure that you are not overwhelming parents like this mean person over here, but instead that when we're in this meeting, we are really celebrating and talking about all the great things that we have with this student. From a family's perspective, remember that the present levels is the first thing a parent sees, and it sets the tone for the meeting. So within that one page, we can either offer hope and a plan for the future or defeat and anger, and it's all within that first page. So make sure that you're prepared and ready to support a family, support the student in this present levels. All right, so how are we going to do this? What's the steps? The first thing you want to do is make sure you avoid at all costs using words of defeat. And those words are can't, don't, won't, refuses, absolutely never does what I tell him to do. We don't want any of that in our IEP. We're going to state every single thing within positive terms, and we're going to frame that in grade level expectations and data so that parents understand what that means. If a student never follows directions, we're not going to say that. We're going to say, given an opportunity to complete a task, John completes his tasks with 0% accuracy. That's a data-driven statement that's stated in positive terms. We didn't say can't, never, won't, doesn't. It's just saying, given a task, he has 0% accuracy. That's a data-driven statement, and that's what we want to use. We don't want to ever say Jay can't read. We want to say Jay is reading 35 words per minute on third grade text. Grade level expectations are to read 120 words per minute. This lets parents know and understand this is what my child can do, positive statement, and this is what's expected so that they can frame that information. Where do we get the data for our present levels? You need to have formal and informal assessments. In this day of response to intervention, we have lots of great data that we can use, and that needs to be part of the IEP. We can also use information from the parents, information from other school personnel. We can use standardized test data, and we can look at behavior observations. There is more great information in the PowerPoint posted in Blackboard. I am going to flip to Word, to the actual IEP, to give us some information here. So for your assignment, you are going to create a name for your student. And yeah, I'm going to use the name, oh, it's already down there. Sorry, I'm going to use the name Sarah M. And at a school, you're usually going to be filling this out in the computer and adding information, but you want to make sure you completely fill it out the top. For a disability, oops, I'm going to use the scroll down menu, and I am going to choose specific learning disability. And we are going to say that Sarah is 10. So the IEP is set up, this is the present levels, it's the first page, and it's set up into sections. We've talked about the communication status is written by the speech and language pathologist. So if a student receives services for specific learning disability and speech and language, know that they will write this section, the speech therapist. If there's no speech therapist, then the box will be checked that their performance is commensurate with their peers. Under the academic performance section, to give you practice, I want you to include the areas that I have included in this sample. I want you to practice, again, I'm not analyzing your data like in an assessment class, making sure your data is correct, but rather I'm making sure that you are able to formulate and write effectively in this present levels. So using the students that are in the sample, I want you to formulate statements that talk about how the student is reading. And I've given you choices here and some samples on what that might look if a student is at a pre-reading level versus reading text in an elementary usually level, or versus reading fluent text in a secondary program. So I want you to construct sentences similar to the examples I've given that focus on positive language, that are structured within grade level expectations. So statements like Sarah can identify, can read, is completing. Those are positive data-driven statements. You also want to make sure that you're talking about their supports, not their supports, their present levels in reading. I want you to talk about their present levels in writing. I want you to talk about their present levels in math. That will give you some really good foundational sentences when you go to write your own IEPs. And remember that there has to be this impact statement at the end of this section that's right here at the bottom. Sarah's current academic performance affects her ability to access the general curriculum. We have to have this access statement because this is what justifies the student having an IEP, and this needs to be included in every section. Under health and vision, please remember you need to include any information about any supports that a student needs, and if they take medication, we want to be as specific as possible. And I gave the example, Dan takes 100 milligrams of Lamictal twice a day, AM and PM. He takes 5 milligrams of melatonin at night to help him sleep. You want to also include a sentence about their medical conditions if it affects their ability to access the curriculum. The same under social and emotional status. Remember that we're writing sentences in positive statements, and again, you need that impact statement. Sarah's current behaviors affect her ability to access the general curriculum. Under general intelligence, remember this is one place where I said we are not going to use the same kind of data we would use in the other sections. Here, we would never include a student's IEQ score because that is very private information, and that information can be subjective depending on how the student participates in that test. So make sure that you're not including an IQ score, but you can include information that's within that report that talks about the student's learning needs and styles. For this student, we checked that they did not have a transition needs because they aren't 16. If we look back up, we said she's 10, so she does not require a transition IEP. This section of special factors we need to fill out, and we need to be very careful if the student's behavior impedes their learning. And remember that impedes doesn't have anything to do with their attitude, specifically, whether a student has cognitive understanding of their behavior. If something that they're doing is impeding their learning, then we check yes. And remember that if you check yes, there's a statement below we need to fill in. For this student, we're going to say she does not have limited English proficiency. She is not blind, and so I don't need to fill out the rest of that. Does the child have communication needs? I'm going to say yes. See present levels, where the speech pathologist would write a goal. Is she deaf or hard of hearing? I'm going to say no, because she is not. Are assistive technology devices needed? She does not need assistive technology. But for the statement of services, because I said up here that her behavior impedes her learning, I have to fill out this section. I am going to say, see specially designed instruction, because I'm going to have information in my goals. See supplementary aids and services, because she's going to need support and testing. And this student, I would have a separate behavior intervention plan, so I would check this. You only check this if you're using the Kentucky Behavior Intervention Plan. There could be something else that you have. You might want to say, talk about how this student works best, learns best, and fill out that information. The other video talks about goals and benchmarks, so I'm going to skip that section and I'm going to come right down here. Oops, sorry, I am going to scroll up for 1 second. Remember that specially designed instruction is what the teacher does, and the Kentucky IEP handbook has very good specific examples. So this could be direct instruction. This could be multiple means of practice. This could be using manipulatives and instruction needs modeling for all math concepts. So any of these